Can you hear me? Oh, you can. Look at that. Right, hopefully this works straight away because it's Linux. It should work, I'm hoping. How's everyone tonight? All good? Good. Marvelous. Almost worked. There we go. Right, so hello, I'm Tom Gallacher. Nice to meet all of you. I'm going to be talking to you tonight about async await. What is async await, you ask? Well, actually, before I start, how many people of you have actually used async await? A few. How many have used in production? 1 or 2, 3. About 3 or 4. Cool, this is good. So I'm going to basically talk to you about async await. So async await is now in Node.js core, ever since Node.js 7.0. But why should you care? Well, apart from the fact that it is awesome, but let's take a step back and we're trying to understand why I think they're awesome and why I think you should think the same. Right. As you all know, asynchronous code can be difficult. Right? Let's take a look at this simple problem. When I run this piece of code, my quote variable prints undefined. Why? Well, because the request is happening asynchronously. And what it could mean is that the quote is either assigned or undefined depending on which one happens first, and you're going to have a race condition. Most likely it's going to be undefined all the time. And it's really confusing. I'm sure all of us have made this mistake in our career once or twice. It's part of the learning process. It's part of learning and understanding asynchronous code and programming in general, especially the Node.js way. So why not just write synchronous code? Well, you know why. But no, in all seriousness, if you want to write synchronous code, use another language which is more suited towards it. But I just had a brain, well, not me, I didn't have a brainwave. Some very clever people had a brainwave and thought, wait a second, what if we make our code look synchronous, but actually make it asynchronous underneath? Would that work? So let's have a little look at some code. So who hasn't seen async await semantics before? So you're all very familiar with it. So yeah, this should be quite familiar to you. So it's really concise. You basically have the same thing as you had before. You assign your quote to your request, and you wait for it. Makes sense, right? And you get the quote coming back from that. It's much easier to read, and yeah, it's just generally a lot cleaner, for me anyway.
Small question. I assume that the console.log, the await line won't block, and it will sort of hand back.
We'll cover that in a second, right. But so async await, it's quite easy to understand, but it comes with some major gotchas. Right. So let's look at gotcha number 1. I sunbird version them just because they're all alpha. So async await is essentially syntactic sugar around promises, which are at the core of async await. So this means that this request function here needs to be promise compatible. So if you were just using the callback version that you had beforehand, you wouldn't be able to just use it straight like this. It just doesn't work. It needs to be promise compatible. So this piece of code wouldn't work straight away, which is a shame. In the past, I've been really opposed to promises. As a Node developer, everything is callback driven. And I've kind of preferred to stay with that to align myself with the Node.js community, especially callbacks and streams in general. However, since enough time's passed now that promises are becoming more and more mainstream and generally more and more popular. So I must cave to the masses and now reveal the ugly truth. So to actually get the request function to act as we want, we need to wrap it in this really ugly promise, which takes a resolve and a reject function, and then we call request with our variable underscore, which is passed into JSON, and then if we have an error, we reject it with that error, and then if we have a the actual body, we resolve it with that body, and then you get the nice semantics around that, and you get the ability to await your request and get back to the original way. It's all in all, it isn't that bad, and there are modules in place that allow you to just promisify any function that you have. And most likely, a lot of modules in your applications now have promise alternatives, and promise API is available to you as well. So it's all in all, you can have one way or the other anyway. You can also do the inverse of that, call it nodifying it, which is basically turning a promise into a callback. So you could do that as well. So gotcha, number 2. So any non-promise compatible asynchronous API must be wrapped. Exactly the same thing as I said earlier. But remember, the Node ecosystem uses callback, error, and then data. So this means any core library, if you're using a Node.js, needs to be wrapped in a promise. Again, there's modules for it, but it can be a massive pain, especially when you just want to use the native API and hack something together. So async await isn't really 100% compatible with Node core. Not yet. There's talks around kind of bringing in a promise API from Node.js core, but it's really in the early stages, and there's kind of a lot of things around that which might be good or might not be good. So there's a working group which you can follow the kind of discussions in, and you can even contribute to that as well, because it's all happening in the open. So on to Gotcha 1.00 Alpha 3. Forgetting to await. Now, this is one of the big ones, and it stung me the first time I used async await. Now, let's take this piece of code, the one that we had earlier, and let's remove the await. So the await, just by request, we're going to remove the await. It becomes troublesome because at this point, you're no longer resolving the underlying promise to a value. And what you get instead, you're just assigning the variable quote to your promise request. So you don't actually get the value. And there's no error. It just happens, and you get a promise going through, and your code can just start making weird things happen if you forget this little piece of syntax. And it's really easy to do, and it's very difficult to spot out with your eyes as well. And I assume it's pretty difficult for a parser to kind of understand when you want to await and when you don't want to await. So that's one of the massive gotchas which really stung me, and it's really difficult for newcomers to async await and promises. So let's go on to number 4. Awaiting many times. You can only really await one thing at a time. So here, you would expect this to happen asynchronously, and you'd have 2 things happening at the same time, and then you get your variables coming back, quote and quote 2. But what's actually happening, it's synchronous inside this block. So you actually, each line is being dispatched, and then once the value gets returned, the next line happens. So it's actually the same as a waterfall in kind of that async callback kind of way. You still get the same results afterwards, and it's kind of what you would expect because it is a synchronous API. But what happens if you want to actually run 2 kind of requests in parallel? And this is where the kind of whole metaphor breaks down of using async await. And this is where you can do something like this. You can basically say destructure quote 1 and quote 2, and then await the result of the promise to all. And this is where you're introducing promises with async await, and it all becomes very messy, I think. So what's actually happening here? So you can actually see that you are dispatching request and request my URL, well, both of them, at the same time. So as soon as this line is parsed, request is being called, and the second request is being called as well. So at that point in time, when that function JSON is called, both of the requests are being dispatched, which means that the requests are going on in the background. Now, all that promise to all does, it doesn't run those promises. All it does, it just gets the reference to each promise and combines it into one nice API, which is another promise, which you can then await. And the result of that promise is when the other 2 have done. It's very confusing, but it's basically not, promise to all is not calling your promises. It's basically you're passing your already called promises very confusing, and there's not really a better way around this. You could kind of just call both of those without awaiting them, and then await them later. And then it's very, very messy and very confusing. So yes, promise.all just basically wraps them into a single promise. Let's go on to number 5 now. So to use these functions, to use async await, well, we've actually only really covered await yet. I've actually totally ignored the async part for this. But you must use these things called async functions. I haven't even got an example in my code. But you can see here, you've got async in front of the function. Now, whenever you want to use await, you need to do this within an async function. You can't do this in a normal function. You need to do it in an async function. That's fine, right? And then you think about, oh, actually, I want to use async await in my piece of code in my legacy application, nested piece of code that's kind of 2,000 modules deep. And then you realize to be even able to use this, you need to either make everything that relies on or calls that function an async function. And then you're like, oh, actually, I need to refactor that many lines of code to even make it async compatible. It gets very bizarre then. Or you then have to convert your async function and get a promise out of it, and then you're dealing with promises, and then what's the point of using async await? So it's very much a thing that you could possibly use from the start, but refactoring again becomes a big issue. And it's something that I struggled with as well, because I introduced it on something that I was working on, and I then realized I had to refactor a lot of things to even get it to work, and it wasn't very fun. So gotcha number 6, and this is pretty much the last one. You have to try to catch them all. And this is the last pun, maybe. Promises, going back to Node.js, you have your callbacks, and you have the first parameter is always your error, and then you have your value. How does that work when you're awaiting a promise? You don't get an error back, because that doesn't make sense. What actually happens is it throws an exception or a unhandled promise rejection, which we'll get to in a second. And it basically means that you can kind of do one of two things. You can use try catch. Yeah, I can deal with that. Oh, I missed that. I double clicked through. Exactly, you can kind of try catch, and again, you can either do that inline in functions or do it outside when you're calling the function. The rejection bubbles up, and you can kind of catch that and then handle it, and then you kind of then have to deal with it there. And yeah. I'm not a massive fan of try catches, but I guess if you're writing more synchronous looking code, it is the right way, it's the proper way. So yeah, it's kind of the better of two evils. But yeah, exactly, yeah, this is what I felt earlier. Another way is to then ignore that and ignore the fact that you're now doing it synchronously and deal with promises again, and use .catch on the result. So you run json.catch, and then you can handle it there. But then, I'm using async await, but now I'm using promises, and I've got to use both of them. I don't know. But as you can see with async await, not everything is rainbows. But at least it's another alternative. For example, I don't like promises, but I like callbacks. I kind of like synchronous code, but I don't like the kind of side effects of synchronous code. I want it to all be asynchronous and be able to handle a nice number of requests and stuff. But it is a nice alternative, and it looks really, really nice. And it's definitely a new way to think about it, a new way to rationalize about your code, and a new way to kind of build applications, which I think is a good way to kind of push forward innovation, to bring new people into the actual language itself and the framework. I think all in all it's quite interesting. And the best thing about it, it takes people away from using transpilers, and they can just use JavaScript inside of Node. Great. So yeah, happy times. I really like this. I like the idea of async await. It really makes me happy. Now, can you use it in production? Yes. So Node 7 is actually stable, and you'll probably hear about this in the next talk after this. I won't go too much deeper, but yeah, Node 7 is stable. Node 6 is LTS, long-term support, means it's supported for a lot longer, but both of them are stable. Have I used it in production? No. Well, I kind of have, but I haven't used actually nodes built in. It's very, very new. It only came in a couple of months ago, if that. But I have used it with transpilers and front end inside TypeScript, and I quite liked it then as well. I did have to get my arm bent to use it, but I actually quite liked it afterwards. So being in Node Core, pretty happy. Will I use it in production? Maybe. I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of things. I've listed all the bad things and haven't really gone into the good things. I mean, the good things is that it looks nice. I can't really think of anything else at the moment. There's a nice, a lot of new modules around the side of this to help kind of like all of the different paradigms and kind of help with control flow of async await applications, or I don't know what you want to call them. But I haven't really explored into it that much detail, and not enough to even use it in production. So I'm still undecided on that, and I think I need a little bit more research to figure out why. But if you have used it, I'd love to hear kind of your experiences from it. So it remarkably quite short. I think I buzzed through that really quickly. But yeah, I'm Tom Gallacher, or at Tom's UK. I work for Wildy. Old logo, forgot that to change that. But if you see anyone with a badge like this, come and speak to us.